while I talk from my Indigenous standpoint, it's within that collective consciousness to be able to elevate and to lift the vibration, to return our foodways for us back into the loving hands of communities.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Kora and welcome. Today's guest is Dr. Jessica Hutchings, a kaupapa Māori researcher, author, and advocate. Jessica is a Hua Parakore Māori organics farmer. She is a director and the founding trustee of Papawhakaritorito Charitable Trust and a leading voice in Aotearoa, New Zealand for Indigenous sovereignty and the protection of Papatuanuku, our Mother Earth. In this discussion, we go deep into Jessica's Māori worldview around GMOs and seed sovereignty, and in particular, her Indigenous feminist perspective. We talk about Hua Parakore, the world's first Indigenous organics verification system, and how all of this relates to decolonizing agriculture and a movement towards rematriation being led by Indigenous women. This was a rich and poignant conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Dr. Jessica Hutchings. Kora, today we are here with Jessica Hutchings. Jessica is the founding trustee of Papawhakaritorito Charitable Trust. Thank you so much, Jess.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, mahi atu kia koe. Tumi tūtahi, mahi atu kia koutou, ko waiahau, ko au he uri o Ngaitahu Ngāti Huirapa. Kei etahi atu taha no Gujarat no India, ahau ko Dr. Jessica Hutchings. Ahau. So just sharing my whakapapa, I hail from Ngaitahu, from Ngāti Huirapa down south, and also too from Gujarat, India, from a little village called Matwad near Dundee Beach, where Gandhiji defied British rule and picked up the salt. So very proud to have that close connection with that movement of Gandhiji and movements of freedom for people.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And maybe we can start with the Papawhakaritorito Charitable Trust. What is the trust and how is it expressing its work?
Yeah, thank you. So Papawhakaritorito literally means, it's a Māori word, and it means to unfold and to regenerate and to unfurl and to regenerate. It's this cycle. It's also too a word that expresses the heart of the flax bush. Regenerating within the context of, family and community. And it's the name of our family farm and of this trust we've just set up. So it is, our key purpose is to uplift Māori organics, Indigenous food sovereignty, and Indigenous self-determination through research, practice, and teaching. So I have a research background, recovered academic, barely, from the university days, background in environmental science and Indigenous studies. And so now having a charitable trust, an Indigenous-led charitable trust, we're able to be in control of our own knowledge production outside of institutions and the criteria that they put on us for saying this is what's important and this is what's not. So we want to uplift food sovereignty and Māori organics as much as we can in Aotearoa, and that's why we've set up the trust. So just about to launch some online courses. We're developing kaupapa Māori products so that these Indigenous-led products to support seed, soil and food resiliency across Indigenous communities, and that's where our heart is, to restore the Indigenous foodways.
And you've been a leading voice around Māori organics and Hua Parakore. I'd love to hear a bit more about that framing, and also, as a first question, like what's different about Māori organics versus the organics that we tend to know in the West?
Māori organics comes from Aotearoa, and so it's culturally located and culturally based here. It brings spirit to food. It brings kaupapa Māori to food, and it reconnects us back with what I describe as our cultural landscapes or our atua-based landscapes, so the landscapes of our deity or our gods. And so in Māori organics, which we actually call Hua Parakore, so Hua being a product and Parakore being free from waste or free from harm, so what we call a pure product, or what our kaumātua or our elders talk about as kai atua. And kai meaning food, atua meaning deity, means that we're actually returning to eat food from the cultural landscapes of our deities. So when we eat kai from Tangaroa, we're actually eating the offerings of Tangaroa. When we eat kai from the whenua, we're eating the offerings from Hiniahoni, from our soil deity, from Haumie Tiki Tiki, the atua of cultivated foods. So what the 4 organic standards have done in Aotearoa is, yes, they've held the line around no pesticides and no chemicals on the whenua and working in ways that are regenerative in terms of soil. But what they've done is they've also, too, at the same time, participated in the colonial erasure of indigeneity in food and farming in New Zealand. And so we have this history in New Zealand that is actually built on agricultural colonisation. And I wonder why in Aotearoa shows like Country Calendar are the most longest running, highest rating New Zealand productions. And from my perspective as an Indigenous woman, it's because that shows like that reinforce agricultural colonisation in the everyday and normalise it. We get fed, agriculture, farming, it's the backbone of New Zealand. Well, it's the backbone of New Zealand on Indigenous land that was stolen. Our people were murdered, were dislocated, were unable to speak their language. And our food sources, our foodscapes, our Indigenous foodways were completely decimated. So while we can say, isn't food and farming great in New Zealand, it's the backbone of the country, it's actually trampled on the rights of Indigenous people and on mana whenua. So what the Hua Parakore is aiming to do is to turn that tide and to make a change and to bring a conscious awareness to organics in Aotearoa that actually there's another layer here, that's indigeneity. And although you might be practicing regenerative agriculture or organics, where is the social responsibility if you do that without even an awareness or an inclusion or a return of benefit back to local communities? And so, now, 2023, Hua Parakore very much connects to and speaks with movements like Rematriation, which is about, the returning of the sacred back to the land, the returning of the sacred back to Earth Mama, to Pachamama, to Papa Tuanuku, to whoever those deities are. And so it's more than just growing Māori organic food. It's a movement for change. It's a fracturing and a return back, to restore our Indigenous foodways that were decimated. The decimation began 200 years ago.
And how is that agricultural colonization continuing to be perpetuated right now? What are some of the ways that you see that many of us might be unaware around?
Well, I think one of the ways is that we continue to produce monocultures within agriculture in Aotearoa. So, I think of the 3 big industries definitely that Māori are involved in, farming, forestry and fisheries. We're talking about monocultures in all of the, even in fisheries with single species fisheries, we're talking about monocultures. And so what we know from colonisation was that the diversity and the differences that Indigenous peoples expressed in relation to the coloniser were trampled out and were pulled away from us. Our language, our cultural traditions, our cultural dress, the way we wear our hair, how we appear, if we have facial, kauai moko, if we have moko, all of these practices were legislated against in Aotearoa. We had a Tohunga Suppression Act that was passed in the early 1900s that outlawed the role of rongua practitioners.
The medicine.
Yeah. So, all of these things are so important, and the Hua Parakore provide a pathway for us to be able to do that. It's not just monocultures. that's agricultural colonisation, it's GMOs as well, and this is a really big issue, and because it just comes into food and farming as part of the mechanisation that happens, we don't actually get to raise our hands and say, hang on, that this isn't a technology that's, appropriate for this country if we're asking this question in a treaty partnership or a treaty relationship. So there's lots of ways that agricultural colonisation continues. Monocultures, GMOs. I think about the free trade agreements that the government's negotiating at the moment, the big FTA with the EU that's been signed, the work that's happening on the CPTPPA, Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Agreement. All of these trade agreements erode our sovereign rights as a nation, and when that happens, that means that the sovereign rights of Māori in relationship to our treaty partner, the Crown, become eroded. So we become powerless to be able to actually say, hang on, we oppose GMOs in the agricultural chapters of this free trade agreement. We oppose patents on life forms. We oppose the tradability of patents on life forms. These are all things that are happening in the everyday around agricultural colonisation. It's, very granular in lots of ways, and I think we're left to feel powerless. And so you often, for me, I wonder, well, where is the place to resist? How do we make change in these spaces? And that's why it's great to be able to talk about it, so that we're aware about what's happening in our food and farming system. And I think just staying in the area of GMOs, when I think about agricultural colonisation, the first wave of colonisation for Māori and for Indigenous peoples was around the theft of our land and our language and our cultures and our customs, and we talk about that as a wave of colonisation. But we can also too think about GMOs as another wave of colonisation that's often referred to as biopiracy. So in this wave of colonisation, biopiracy, now it's about the colonisation of our biological resources and our assets, so at that molecular or at that DNA level. And, it's like the plunder of nature and knowledge, but the nature is nature that we have whakapapa or genealogical connections to, so it's not just nature.
Right. Separate, right?
No, it's actually, these are our tūpuna. We say Papatuanuku is our earth mother, but ko Papatuanuku hoki aho. I also too embody Papatuanuku. Ko hini ahuoni tira, our soul deity is out there. Ko auhe hini ahuoni aho. I also too am the soul deity. There is no separation between us and nature. So when we talk about biopiracy and we talk about wanting to protect the molecular essence of nature, for us as Māori, as Indigenous people, we're talking about protecting the essence of our relations. And so that becomes a very different type of conversation when you're having those conversations with genetic scientists, with trade negotiators, or with governments around protecting the rights. The other issue around biopiracy, and what I really love about this term is, it just conjures up this image of a pirate going in to plunder somebody else's resources, Indigenous people's resources. But the pathway to, more often than not, for knowing what the benefit or the property, the bioactive property in flora and fauna is often through Indigenous knowledges. And so a lot of our rongoa practitioners have published material, or even non-Indigenous people have published material about the medicinal benefits of rongoa Māori, of traditional Māori medicine. So it's all available in a book. And that's just fodder for a biochemist, a genetic scientist who's thinking, oh, well, what's that bioactive compound in kawakawa that we can identify, that we can manipulate through genetic technologies to create a novel product, to then take a patent out over it. And then before we know it, we've lost the ability to care for that life form because it's owned and controlled by a corporation.
Right. And so there's so many issues here that I I think it's really important that we're having this conversation, because obviously this is a topic that's alive for you and for the country and for the world, as these technologies are rapidly advancing in their kind of ability to alter the patterns of life, let's say. And so, yeah, I'm curious, like, so it seems like there's one part here, which is the ethics and philosophies that underpin the idea that we should be manipulating nature in these ways. And what does that say about our worldview, and what are the ramifications and implications of that? And then there's, of course, this patent issue, this idea that, you know, we can privatize and own, you know, another being in nature in this way, and to profit from it, and to, you know, kind of narrow the benefits, and especially kind of making that a financially minded set of benefits in terms of how we cultivate crops and food and so forth. And then there's also the question of governance and power. You know, like, who's making all of these decisions? How is this all coming to be? You know, what is the conversation about it? What, you know, who's being consulted? So yeah, maybe I don't know if that's a good, you know, teasing apart a few different issues, but curious, you know, how you're seeing the landscape, and then maybe we can zoom in on a few of these. I'd love to understand your worldview in terms of what do you think is happening, what should be happening differently.
Yeah. I think I'll just touch back on the point you made around, you know, the commodification of nature, that we can own life forms, you know, that can contribute potentially to, you know, supposed greater food security, but we know that that's a myth and a lie. So the commodification or the ownership of life forms isn't new on the planet. You know, it's what happened to African people when they were taken as slaves to the great free land of America, to then be forced to be able to be in food or cotton production to perpetuate capitalist economies.
Right.
So capitalism requires inputs. You know, it requires inputs, and Indigenous peoples and nature have been the inputs that have fueled extractive-based capitalism for many years. Not just Indigenous peoples, developing countries as well. So I think when we think about GMOs and the commodification of life forms, we can't erase that prior history of the commodification of people through slavery. That still continues to happen because capitalism has paved the way for this type of thinking to happen and these types of practices to happen. What we're doing now through technologies is we're just doing that at the absolute molecular level. So we've gone from whole beings, whole beautiful black beings, human beings, being commodified, traded as slaves, to now doing that with the absolute essence of life forms, which for us as Indigenous people are, as I said earlier, our relations and are our whanaunga.
Right.
So, you know, our Māori worldview, and I definitely do, you know, and we're just as diverse as Pākehā people, as all communities. There isn't a singular Indigenous view, but there are very clear instructions from our ancestors through our whakatauki, through our proverbs, through our pūrākau, through our stories, through our mōtiatia, through our chants, through our waiata, through our songs. So although there isn't a unified Māori view, the instructions are there for us in terms of guiding us around what to think. So just because we're in 2023 and we are at what feels like kind of, you know, the convergence of multiple crises, we're pushed to look at technologies as a potential solution. But every generation prior to us has been at these points of multiple crises. Maybe not at the sixth extinction event, at the edge of this, or in the beginning of it. But really for us as Indigenous peoples, we come back to looking into our own frameworks about what is going to work for us. Where do the solutions lie? So there's just a couple of things I want to say about that. I want to just, but before I go into that, just connect in about some of the Māori concerns around GMOs and talk about three things in particular, three Māori concepts. Three Indigenous concepts that I'm sure would resonate with other Indigenous communities around the world because our worldviews are very similar, interconnected, connected with nature, intergenerational oral transmission of knowledges, collectivized knowledge systems, and guided by the instructions of our ancestors. Those are very similar dimensions of Indigenous knowledges across communities. So from this standpoint in Aotearoa, if we think about GMOs, there's three issues that I want to raise. One is around the impact on Māori, so the impact on the life force or the vibration or the energetic well-being of the organism. And so for Māori, everything has a Māori, everything has a life force. And in fact, in Māori organics, it's what we use as our indicator to understand the well-being of the farm or the food production or the food that's being produced. And it's about coming back to our divine, intuitive, Indigenous knowings to understand whether or not the Māori is rich or the Māori is well or the Māori is depleted. Now, with my Western science hat on, because I'm trained as an environmental scientist, we might look at things like bricks, or we might look at things like water quality, or we might look at things like pH. We get to the same point, through Western science and Indigenous knowing, but the way we get there is really different. So if we start from the premise that every being has a Māori, and where does that Māori come from? It comes from the realms of the atua, atua, so a-tua, atua. Meaning, in that next space, going forward. So atua, and tua means, I find it so hard to translate Māori words on the go. Tua means over the other side, kei toa te puke, over the other side of the mountain, of the hill. And so atua, our atua realms, is actually on the other realm. It's the other side. It's not in the human realm. So Māori comes from those atua realms. And it's not for us as humans, as tangata, to interfere with those realms. So, other people might say, oh, well, right, that's an argument that fits in with the churches and that type of belief. So, you're saying kind of God, it's a spiritual realm. It doesn't have, well, actually, yes and no. Big no, really, because it's the way that we think about things. And so Māori is right at the heart of it. It's the heart of a healthy food system. It's the heart of a healthy forest ecosystem, a healthy waterway, Māori. So what happens to the Māori of an organism when we manipulate the DNA? That's one concern we have. GMOs impact on the Māori of an organism. They impact on the mana of an organism, and mana is a Māori word that often understand as power, prestige. Maybe prestige is a better way to understand it. We have an inherent mana, but mana is also too, mana atua can come from the gods, come from the deity. And I think about it in relation to some of the contemporary conversations that are happening at the moment around protecting the sovereign rights of nature, advocating for the sovereign rights of nature, which is essentially advocating for the mana of nature. So te urawera, being returned personhood status, te awa te pua, whanganui, being returned personhood status, is a way to elevate and to uplift the mana of those entities, of those beings. And so Māori communities, generally speaking, have an issue with GMOs because it impacts on the mana of that living being or of that organism. And then the third area that impacts on GMOs is around whakapapa, is around genealogy. But I like to think about whakapapa more broadly than just genealogy. I like to think about it as a layering and a building of knowledges to come to understand. And so that, what happens to an organism when we move the DNA around within an organism, it impacts on that whakapapa of an organism. And I've had genetic scientists say to me, well, just exactly where is that whakapapa located and that Māori located? And so they're so precise in their technologies that they could possibly manipulate the, undertake their science in a way where, oh no, don't worry, that the Māori's in that gene, we just won't touch that one. The way we make sense of the world in Indigenous communities for Māori is we look at the interconnections and we go out and we go bigger. Whereas the framework for thinking through Western science is reductive and mechanistic. And it's about going, oh, well, actually, no, right, okay, so we're out here in an ecosystem. Hang on, I want to go in, let's look at ecosystem services, let's go in a little bit more. We just want to focus on water. We're interested in, yes, the water, but how's the water interacting with the catchment? And what's happening with the communities in the catchment, and how is their well-being? So it's more of a, the way that I think we can come to an analysis around GMOs is not what's going on under the microscope, what's going on out in the bigger ways, in the bigger interconnected world in terms of how we think.
Mm-hmm.
In 2000, there was a Royal Commission on Genetic Modification in Aotearoa, and I think it's really important that we come back to the longer history of debate that's happened in this country. We've only had, I think, about 5 Royal Commissions in New Zealand, so that mechanism is only used when it's, an issue of national significance. And a lot of Māori submitted to the Royal Commission. There were 9 parties out of the 118 or something, but 9 parties, Māori parties, that gained interested person status. And I participated with a group of Māori women in a rōpū called Ngā Wahine Te Aki o Te Ao to present evidence to the Royal Commission that GMOs were impacting on the right of Indigenous women, Māori women, to continue to uphold our role as kaitiaki, or as, I'll just say watchers without using the word guardians, watchers, people responsible, women responsible for future generations, not just of humans, but the future of our flora and fauna, which in fact we see as the descendants of Ranginui and Papatuanuku. So they are the children, our biodiversity are the children of Sky Father and Earth Mother. But all of those Māori parties that gave evidence to the Royal Commission opposed GMOs for various reasons. And so we've had a debate, the Y262 claim, we've been to the tribunal, Māori communities, numerous times over GMOs. So we need to really keep looking back to understand what do we want to say in the present moment about GMOs, and where are we tracking to for the future? Aotearoa has a amazing opportunity to be a seed saver for the rest of the world. And I think, while we can keep fighting the corporations and GMOs that are coming into Aotearoa, into food and farming, what about this opportunity for New Zealand to actually be a seed-saving country of GMO-free seeds for the rest of the world? We're an island nation, part of the OECD. We could be supplying GMO-free seeds to the rest of the world when actually in places like Europe and America, it's very hard because of GMO contamination to be able to maintain regular seed stocks of GMO-free seeds. So it's, again, turning our mindset to an alternate type of economy and a different way of thinking that doesn't play into the hands of life science corporations with vested offshore interests to dictate to us what we should be doing on our whenua in food and farming in Aotearoa. So it's that breaking of that agricultural colonisation at the GMO level to say, actually, there's a whole different way we can do things here.
Thank you for sharing that.
The rant.
No, it was so good.
There's a lot to say about GMOs.
Why is this issue surfacing now again? Like you said, we've had this debate. Yeah. We've decided to go the route of no GMOs in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and yet now it's resurfacing.
I think 2 decades is a long enough time to go, we need to revisit this again. I think the pro-science GMO lobby is knocking on the door of government really hard at the moment. And I think the vested interests of science corporations and organisations cannot be underestimated. So it's not just coming from New Zealand, it's coming from offshore as well. These are global corporations. And they're just knocking. They're knocking everywhere around the world. And in most cases, they're not actually knocking. They're just bashing the door down and displacing communities and displacing Indigenous knowledges around agriculture, peasant knowledges around agriculture and food and farming to, recreate monocultures as they have done in other parts of the world on lands which have traditionally been full of diversity, not just in terms of plants and food, but in terms of the diversity of knowledge systems and the way that we come to know things. And I think that's, the Hua Parakore system, Māori organic system, is about a return back to our divine Indigenous senses as Indigenous peoples. And, what does that mean? You kind of have to take a bit of a breath and go, divine Indigenous senses. Okay, what does that mean? I've grown up as in a very colonised reality. I didn't grow up with my Indigenous language. I've had to relearn all of that as an adult. Most people of my generation did, because our parents were banned from speaking it at school, so it wasn't a language that was spoken at home. So then here I am at 51 trying to go, how do I return to my divine Indigenous senses? Well, as Indigenous peoples, we have to stop and we have to connect in with nature, connect in with our whanaunga, with our relations in nature, to reconnect again with our divine Indigenous senses, which are not necessarily all about looking down a microscope. They're a lot bigger than that. And so we're coming at it from a very different standpoint, and to be able to communicate that, impacts of mana, mauri, whakapapa, from GMOs to scientists, trade negotiators. It's a really difficult thing to do, but it's our ancestors did it, not over GMOs. They did it over the protection of their lands and their forests and their fisheries. Other Indigenous ancestors have done it. And so this is the fight that we're fighting right now as Indigenous peoples in Aotearoa, Indigenous women in particular, against biopiracy happening.
Yeah. It's not a topic that I have a lot of depth around. I feel like I have to get more educated because it's going to become increasingly relevant. But my understanding of the discourse is, certainly that Māori is not, if you can't see it under the microscope, it's kind of being ignored altogether as part of the discussion. Yeah. So putting that aside, the mana, the kind of rights of this of these beings, and what is our right to infringe on that. That's also a bit like, okay, we have dominion, and then I'm really interested in this whakapapa and the context, because when I speak with people in the past around the kind of people who have maybe a more environmental science lens, who are in favor of really advancing this field around genetic modification, I feel like the argument is very much around, listen, when we do farming, when we do gardening, we're selecting certain species and we're effectively influencing each generation and subsequent generation. And this is just an extension of that that's no different. And I think what you're offering a glimpse of for me is a perspective about, you have to look at all of the interrelationships and the full context in which it's operating. But I'm wondering if you can speak more to that and that kind of, particular line of thinking, that this is actually no different than what we've always been doing with farming.
It's completely different. And why it's completely different is that, seeds will take on different traits season after season if we're saving them ourselves. And so this is why it's great as a grower to save seeds from your environment, and even as a biodynamic grower to hold the seeds in your mouth before you plant them, so that they take on that vibration, treating like with like. But these are all things that happen in nature naturally. What does not happen in nature naturally, one is transgenic research or genetic manipulation, so that's across species. Frog genes into a tomato to increase the shelf life or the stability of a tomato. I mean, buy a tomato from the supermarket and it can last red and not rot for 4 to 5 weeks. I mean, what's going on with that? So genetic modification doesn't happen naturally, and that's a myth. And so I think it's just really important to get very clear on the science of the technologies and not to allow scientists to confuse us with the science. I have a PhD from the science faculty. I did my PhD on a Māori feminist analysis of genetic modification to really, I suppose, bridge the world that actually Indigenous feminist critiques have something to offer very specifically in a very critical analysis around these types of technologies. These types of technologies emerge from the thinking of the Enlightenment, from the thinking of Descartes and Bacon, where we had the separation of man over nature, and then we had the feminization of nature, and we have people like Bacon, quoted to say things like, "Nature is an unruly beast, we must tame her. We must jump upon this wild beast. She is unruly, we must tame her." Well, at that moment in that thinking, in that period of the Enlightenment, we had two things happen. We had the separation of humans from nature. All of a sudden, we're not nature. All of a sudden, we've positioned ourselves above nature. And then we have the feminization of nature, which allows for the continuation of the exploitation, patriarchal, misogynist exploitation of nature through science and technologies, because then all of a sudden the standpoint of how we see the world has completely changed. We've placed ourselves above her, and the gaze of the other, the gaze of the male scientist down upon nature as a feminized entity, gives the male scientists the ability to control and do whatever they want. They've had dominion over women's bodies for so many centuries, and so now here's a reductive mechanistic knowledge system that is the foundation of Western science and our thinking. And I think this is what Indigenous critiques have to offer. This is the work that we do. Peel back the layers to understand where this thinking emerged from. So when you ask, just going back to your question, when you asked that question before, what is it any different? Let's just go right back to where these technologies started from and what gave the ability for scientists to actually feel like they had the right to be able to do that. Back to that Enlightenment thinking and back to some of those, the so-called founding forefathers of Western science. To unpick it. So these are the wider conversations that we need to have.
Can you say more about the Indigenous feminist perspective and more that we should be aware of or exploring in our current discourse?
Indigenous women have always spoken up for the rights of nature and have always spoken up and been advocates and activists for the well-being of their families and their communities. My ancestors, other Indigenous communities, women's ancestors have always done this work. But right now in 2023, this movement of Indigenous women speaking up for the rights of nature, bringing forward their critique around things like GMOs, the inequalities in the food system, the commodification of seeds, the continuing poisoning of the environment, is manifesting itself in a very powerful movement called Rematriation. And so this is a movement that's particularly coming out of Turtle Island, being led by Indigenous women to speak up very, very clearly and to rematriate the power back to Mother Earth, back to our deities. And so this is what we are doing in the Māori Organics movement as well. We are advocating for the sovereign rights, for personhood status to be attributed to Hiniahuoni, to our soils. So in what ways can we elevate the mana of soil? In what way can we elevate the mana of Hiniahuoni, of our soils? And so this is the work that Indigenous women in Aotearoa and the organics movement are doing. We're asking these questions, but we're asking it with a gendered lens. Earlier on this year, we had the beautiful opportunity to travel to Turtle Island and meet with Indigenous women from the Onondaga Nation in upstate New York, and they are doing amazing work saving their seeds. We were able to walk into a seed bank run by Native women that had over 300 varieties of grandmother and grandfather seeds in there. And so, movements like braiding the sweetgrass, movements like Hua Parakore, movements of rematriation, movements of standing up for our ancestral maunga, as people in Hawaii have done with maunga kia, are all part of resistance movements that have been led by Indigenous women. We've had enough. I mean, we've had enough. How long do we keep going on and fall without speaking up? And so the world's changing rapidly, and I truly believe, and I have a deep knowing, that Indigenous women and Indigenous knowledges is where change resides, that it's Indigenous women's knowledges and our love for our food and our communities and our families and for people and for nature that actually is going to restore food systems and restore communities. And so I think we need to be really making way for Indigenous women's voices to be coming to the forefront.
And you mentioned you're bringing a gendered lens. I'm curious, 2023, we live in a time where there's a lot of discussion about how do we move beyond binaries, and curious in this perspective what you could offer.
That's a great question, and as someone who identifies as takatapu, as queer, as Indigenous and queer, or two-spirited, lots of beautiful names for it, I find it problematic to talk about women in that binaried way. But what I think about when I think about mana wahine, which is what I would describe as Māori feminism, is that it's not bound to a gendered body, that it's a ideology, it's a philosophical stance that we take that uplifts the dimensions or the kaupapa, the elements that are deeply important to the kaupapa that Māori women would uphold. And I think of the late Moana Jackson, one of our most amazing Māori philosophers of our time, who's a dear friend of mine, and I would often be in a lot of hui or projects with Moana where it was all Māori women and then it was Moana, and the reason for that was that he purported a mana wahine feminist analysis all the time, because he could understand and he could see the impact that masculinity, misogyny and patriarchy was having, not necessarily ascribed to the gendered body. And so I think that's where we need to, what we need to think about. Yeah.
Got it. And so you mentioned bringing, effectively rights of nature status to soil. And we've been talking to folks about the rights of nature movement in a lot of different contexts. So, but I don't hear very many folks talking about it in the context of soil. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can share more about that. Maybe we can tie it in a bit more about the work from the Hua Parakore perspective as well.
Yeah. I'm happy to give translations too, because I'm just going to speak in te reo. But if you want some translations of this for subtitling this, but
please.
There's a beautiful whakatauki. Me aro koe ki te hā o hini a hōne. Pay heed to the dignity of women. Me aro koe ki te hā o hini a hōne. And so if we really are paying heed to the dignity of women, as that whakatauki, the instruction from our ancestor tells us, then in our country, in Aotearoa, because of agricultural colonisation, she has been so degraded. But we also too know this globally. The FAO tell us we've got less than 50 harvests left globally because of global soil erosion. But in Aotearoa, it's our time right now to speak up for her. Enough is enough. Enough digging up her body to make new roads, to create greenhouse gas emissions, enough poisons on her, enough pesticides on her, enough tilling. Thank you very much. That's it. We're done. We're done. now has a hara and a harm, and I can feel it in my body, and I know other Māori women I also too work within the Hua Parakore movement feel it very deeply. You know, I wrote into Mahionioni Hua Parakore, the Māori Soil Sovereignty Handbook, that soil is our ancestor. She's our divine being, but she doesn't have a voice, and very little people speak up for her. And so this is really our role as activists, as Indigenous women who are activists, as queer women who are activists, to speak up for the sovereign rights of nature. And so we are advocating in every space that we can, and just talking about advocating to elevate the mana of Hiniahuoni, to return personhood status to her. And how would that mean then, if we returned personhood status? How would we walk differently on the whenua? How would we think about growing our food differently? What would we think about putting a tractor down and deep ripping and all of the things that are part of our agricultural practices in the everyday? What does it mean when we have plastic wrap on the farm around baleage and then we just let that float around the paddocks or it ends up in rivers? I see it all the time. So these are our tūpuna from Aotearoa. This is the history of this whenua right here, and it begins with Papa Tuanuku and with Hiniahuoni, and our role is to stand up and to speak for the ancestral rights. So when when I'm talking about GMOs and I'm opposing GMOs, I'm also too thinking, what's the impact of a compostable or a biodegradable vegetable, say, that's been genetically modified, and then that is degraded back to Hiniahuoni? Is she ready to hold that? Does she have the capacity to hold that? What will happen when that interacts with our divine being, with our sacred being? So it's all connected, the advocating for the sovereign rights of nature, for soil, for Hiniahuoni, is connected with opposing GMOs. Because as we know as Indigenous peoples, everything is connected. Our world isn't reduced to that reductive and mechanistic way of looking down that microscope to try and understand it.
Right. And so you mentioned advocating in every context possible.
Yeah.
I know you have a new series that you're working on with Māori television. Can you share more about that? Really
excited about this. We've just finished. We've got one more day of pickup shots to do, but we've just been, we filmed an 8-part TV series for Whakaata Māori, for our Indigenous network, on the Hua Parakore. And so 8 episodes, 6 episodes working with other Hua Parakore growers and hearing the diversity of ways that Māori organic producers are expressing Hua Parakore in their food and farming practices. Because it's not a standardised system. It's not saying, well, to express mauri you have to do this, to express mana you have to do this. All of our tribes in New Zealand, all of our hapu, our sub-tribes, are independent sovereign nations, and that was affirmed to us in the Declaration of Independence and then reaffirmed into Te Reti o Waitangi in the Treaty of Waitangi. So all of our independent sovereign nations have their own kawa and their own tikanga for expressing kaupapa Māori. And so what that means for the Hua Parakore is all of our people in their different places with all their diversity can express Hua Parakore in their ways that are located to the areas that they stand in. So what I'm going to love about this series is that we've got this whole diversity of all of these different kind of communities of Hua Parakore growers doing it in their area, in their ways.
Right.
So I think it's really empowering. The Hua Parakore is the first international Indigenous organic verification system around in the world. And so that's really exciting. We've got Indigenous growers in Hawaii, in Rarotonga. I've had interest from Thailand who are really interested in picking it up. So although it's Māori, like I said earlier, our frameworks and our ways of knowing just relate to all Indigenous communities, so they can put their own practices, their own cultural practices into the framework. We were very lucky to be able to travel to India to go to Navdanya and to meet with Dr. Vandana Shiva, whose work has influenced my whole career. I think when I was a little puppy in my 20s at university, reading Staying Alive and catching on to that concept of maldevelopment. I was really interested in understanding the impact of development on Indigenous communities and those people in developing countries. And then she had this term maldevelopment, which really just explained the impact that development's having, or the unwanted impact that development was having on Indigenous communities, developing countries, peasant communities, subsistent communities. And that was a hook for me. I was like, oh, I can think like this. I totally get this. And then I've just been reading her work for decades and connected with her at various times across organic movements. I really wanted to film an episode at Navdanya because, one, it's a biodiversity farm, but also, two, I consider her to be the most important environmental activist of our time. A woman of colour speaking truth to power, taking on the corporations, but with such hope and optimism for the future. And I think that's what's so powerful about it, because we can talk GMOs, we can talk agricultural colonisation. Oh, we can get the sixth extinction event. I mean, the list just goes on, and we can become so despondent. But for Dr. Shiva, I asked her at the end of the interview, I said, how do you brush this off? How do you keep light? Because, I mean, for me as an Indigenous activist, I get weary sometimes. There's tears that are shed every week because it feels too much. And I was sitting in her living seed bank at the back of the farm with her, and there was some millet hanging down. And she said, looked at the millet, and she said, very fine seeds on a millet, and there's hundreds of them. And she's like, one seed at a time, just one seed at a time. And I think when we take that standpoint, there's hope and there's optimism. And I really wanted to have her in the series because I think our Indigenous critique and analysis is always sharpened by being able to travel and to be able to have that opportunity to hear people like her talk, and the power of television or the power of media to be able to bring her into the homes of Māori and Indigenous communities by having her as part of the series was really important. But the other thing too is that her work and her commitment has been so connected to organics. And I don't know if many people make that connection. She's been a stalwart in organics ever since, for the last 2 or 3 decades. She's been at the majority of the iFoam conferences. She's always advocating for the rights of organics. Her teaching work at Schumacher College and Totnes in the UK, always connected with organics and earth democracy, ecological restoration, about farming naturally, mainly because that's how our people in India farmed before the chemical companies came along in the Green Revolution. I know in the village where my family's from, my grandfather had land, and it was really important to him to have bullocks. It was very important for him to be able to farm in ways that were subsistent, and he could do it all himself. And then they could produce the food that they needed, or within that village community, actually. All the food, the diversity of food that was needed, someone did this, someone did that, someone did this. I don't think it was organised. I think that's just how it happened. And then in the morning, different people would walk around and be selling their produce. So there was this diversity. So this is what Indian communities or village life is like. So she's grown up and seen that. And then when you've grown up with that and you see what's going on in industrial globalized agriculture, and you have lived through the displacement and the erosion of village, peasant and Indigenous knowledges in food and farming being eroded because all of a sudden you have new technologies, new seed stock, GMOs, pesticides and fertilizers coming into your country through the Green Revolution, then of course you need to say something about it. And I think what we're having in New Zealand at the moment is kind of our own little mini green revolution. I think we need to think about GMOs within that context of, learning from what Dr. Shiva's taught us about the impact of the Green Revolution, because those communities cannot recover from the Green Revolution while they still are trapped into those dysfunctional relationships with the agricultural corporations and the seed companies.
Yeah, what I love about that quote you said, one seed at a time, and so much of what you shared about monocrop versus diversity, and all of these different small growers and farms and villages having sovereignty and being able to have the connection with their place, their people, their land, and express itself, versus what's happened with these large monolithic corporate or governance approaches. Like that tension to me is so important right now in the conversation around money as well. We've been talking to a lot of folks around, how do we bring more capital into regenerative activities? And it becomes a conversation about governance and power and decision making. Money tends to want to be homogenous and pool into these large sums, and so when we talk about things like carbon credits or biodiversity credits or other types of ecological outcomes that we're trying to optimize for, there's this tension that I see emerging between kind of one size fits all. Let's roll out the carbon standard. Let's roll out the biodiversity standard. And very well-intentioned people working on these ideas because they're trying to recognize the value of nature in our economic system, which currently only recognizes it from an extractive point of view. But the concern is that we're losing that recognition that it is one seed at a time, one place at a time. And so what I'm trying to connect here is back to the Hua Parakore system as well, because you had a beautiful film that was created with Happen Films. We'll put links in the show notes. And one of the things you said about that was it's not like a typical certification in the organic system where someone comes in with a lab coat, spends a few hours on your farm, ticks a few boxes, that it was actually kind of community-led. It was like the consensus of the community in which the place sat. And I feel like that is that essence, that organizing pattern is what we're trying to move towards in a lot of different contexts, whether it's around food or money or governance. And so, I would love to just pull that thread a bit more, how you've learned about that repatterning back to what our ancestors were doing. And any other comments of what I've just kind of tried to stumble and share upon?
I'll give you a translation for this, but there's another, because as you're talking, I'm thinking of this other beautiful whakatoki, another instruction from our ancestors and our knowledges that's been passed on. He hara te tō te takitahi, te tō te takitini. It's not the strength of one, but it's the strength of many. So we know from our teachings, from our tūpuna, that actually working collectively is part of who we are. And I said a little bit earlier that Indigenous knowledges are a collectivised form of knowledge building, and that they're intergenerationally passed down, usually through oral transmission. So it's just a no-brainer to have an organic system, which is, I talk about it as gaining collective consent from the community. Who are we more accountable to if we're not accountable to our families who live with us and our community and our neighbours and the people that we serve through growing food? I'm so much more accountable to them than a white man who I don't know, who rocks up probably late, hasn't got time for a cup of tea. This was my experience of Western organic certification. No time for a cup of tea, turned up a bit late, did a spade dig, shook my hand, and then jumped in his ute and drove off, and the next year I had someone different. To restore food systems, which is, yes, the Hua Parakore is about Māori organics, but we want to restore our Indigenous foodways, and that's relational. That's not just about getting a certificate and going, I'm organic or I'm Hua Parakore. It's about building relationships, restoring our food communities again. And that's how we work as Indigenous peoples. It's always collective, always collective. This is the work that I do and the Trust does as kaupapa Māori researchers, as decolonising researchers. It's about decentering the power of knowledge production from the individual back into the hands of communities. And from my standpoint, I'm interested in the knowledge production, mana wahine, those types of knowledges. So Indigenous feminist knowledges, staying away from that, the binary nature of gendered bodies, but the feminist, those mana wahine-based knowledges, which are earth-based knowledges, sovereign rights of nature knowledges, collectivized, connected with communities and with families. So, yeah. You made just talking about, I think money's an interesting thing. It's always something that's just out there, but the work of the movements that I've been involved in over, 3 decades working in this space, they carry on anyway, with or without money. Sometimes money can get in the way, to be honest. And we're all just so used to working for mahi aroha, for volunteer work, because you're driven by the need to speak up for the ancestral rights of soil. I'm going to do that regardless if anybody pays me or not. It's what we do. It's when you feel it deeply and it's embodied, you do not then have the ability to turn it off. And so it's your job, that's your path, and that's the calling, and that's what you understand that you are here to do in the short time that you have. So, what I would say about money in particular is we're very aware about the misappropriation, the commodification of Indigenous knowledges at this moment in time of a crisis. Crises are a great time, one for the science lobby and the GMO lobby to go, we'll save you. But they're also a time where people's communities, organisations are looking for other ways of knowing. And so all of a sudden we see an increase in the value and the acceptance of Indigenous knowledges. But our people have been saying this for generations. My grandparents have been saying this, and my great-great-grandparents have been saying this, and my great-great-great-grandmother was saying this. So there's nothing different really to what I'm saying than to what my ancestors were saying, but now the world wants to listen. What are they going to do with that knowledge, and how are they going to receive it, and who gets to take it, and how are the rights to access and share benefits back with Indigenous communities is incredibly important. And this is something that came out of the Convention on Biological Diversity in the 90s when that was signed. Article 8J talks about the rights and the access of benefit sharing to Indigenous peoples around biodiversity knowledges. And so, yes, our worldviews might be something that the world needs to hear at the moment, but don't commodify them. How can you come along? I often think about what an ally looks like. And I have a lot of non-Indigenous peoples wanting to connect up and to do this type of work and that type of work. And in the words of Leonie Pihama, another Māori woman whose work I really respect, she describes an ally as somebody who walks behind or walks beside, but never in front. And so as we open up the Hua Parakore system for non-Indigenous peoples, which is what our elders always told us, and that's a complexity within itself, as Indigenous peoples, we're having to labour to teach non-Indigenous peoples how to be a good ally in our system. And that's what our elders instructed us to do, so that's what we're doing. And for myself personally, I think, yes, that work's important, but there's also 2 other work that I really need to do, I have a calling for, and that's not necessarily to teach the other all of the time. And so the power of media, to be able to actually get a message out there really quickly, is really important. And this is the work that the Trust is doing, is around storytelling and around setting up a Indigenous-led educational platform where we can tell these stories of Indigenous-led rematriation. We can tell the stories or the opposition to GMOs from our own standpoint. So we don't have to pop up in this non-Indigenous space and have a conversation with this group, or this non-Indigenous space and have the same conversation, oh my God, with that one. mean, the number of times Indigenous women have given the same presentation in their career, it's just off the hook. And for the non-Indigenous person receiving it, it's blowing their mind. We've been saying this forever, and if actually you really want to operationalise that, and if it's really moved you, then support co-governance. Support Te Reo Māori being taught at schools. Stand up for racism. Don't let the brown people or the Māori person have to be the person to stand up for racism. One of the things that I see in food and farming and permaculture and the regenerative movement in New Zealand is the co-opting, which is a very kind word for really what I'm saying is the theft of Māori language to be able to name or express what non-Indigenous peoples are wanting to do in their community garden or in their different places. And, there's an example actually in our local area that I know we both know of, and I'm going to talk about it because I don't think you and I have had this conversation, and it's mahinga kai. Ko tira kupu he whakaro no ngaitahu, mahinga kai. There's a practice of my people down in the South Island, mahinga kai. It's not actually a practice of tribes in the North Island. And my ancestors, yes, were coastal people, but mainly lived in the interior, in Te Waipounamu, in the middle of in the islands. And that was dictated to by the food sources that were around. And so more so than other tribes in Aotearoa, you could say we were, nomadic's not the right word, but we travelled, we moved, and we moved for food sources. And that's mahinga kai. That's what the practice of mahinga kai is. It is a practice that is located to Indigenous peoples in a space that's connected to whakapapa. It is not a concept that's floating around like Indigenous concepts for anybody to grab and go, oh, yeah, mahinga kai, no, that's what we're doing. We'll have that and we'll put that on our business. Or, yeah, we're, not Indigenous peoples, but we'll take this Māori name and we'll put it on our business because we really want to support indigeneity. Well, one of the ways to grow indigeneity is not to commodify our culture, our language and our culture, and to ask first. And if you want to do that, then you just be really aware that you will get pulled up for doing that. That actually, in the Māori, I've worked in the science space for a couple of decades, and in science in New Zealand, we have evolved beyond that commodification in lots of ways. I couldn't have said that 10, 15 years ago, but there's been so much work done to really support non-Indigenous scientists to work with Mātauranga Māori or Indigenous knowledges in New Zealand, and there's a code of ethics, really. But it seems to me in food farming and permaculture and regenerative agriculture that they need to go through that same decolonising process. So it makes some movements hard to come together sometimes when, we come to events as Indigenous peoples and we're hearing about these great regenerative agriculture or wanting to feed people or community gardens, and they're all by non-Indigenous people. Great, because we've all got to do something to try and transform food communities. But why are they picking this bit of our culture and that bit and this bit, and then they can't talk to it or can't even pronounce it properly? It's just not okay anymore. And so these are the things we have to call out, and with a loving heart, you have to call it out, with a loving heart, with a loving heart, so that people aren't too badly bitten by it, but they know that it's not okay, because that is a continuation of agricultural colonisation.
Right.
And that's what we need to stop. And this is my little bit of a concern with regenerative agriculture. Yeah. Everybody wants to tell a story. And so indigeneity gets picked up as a way to be able to tell that story. But then I think what's important to us is the ability, and you mentioned it before when you talked about money, to have access to resources and power and control. And so in te tiriti relationships, when we're negotiating with the Crown or when we're thinking about working with the Crown, those are my two questions. So where does power lie and who's got the resources? So I'm at a table with 10 government agents and you're all being paid, and here we are, we've just, barely cobbled the petrol money together to get to the meeting and none of us are being paid, but you want all of our knowledge to make your work treaty compliant or to do what you need to do.
Right.
So equity is really important as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that frame really makes it obvious the importance of having Hua Parakore and sovereign space that's distinguished in its memetics and in its narrative and in its understanding than just regenerative agriculture, which will, continue to become used and overused and greenwashed and, mean different things to different people in a way that we lose that conversation about agricultural colonization. And it's you've given me a lot to think about as well in this conversation. Thank you so much, Jess, for so generously sharing your knowledge and the trust and faith. And I'm confident that people are, especially if they're still listening to us now, getting a lot of value from it. Do you have any other final reflections or anything else that you'd like to share?
Just probably the last thing to end on in the conversation is just the notion of aroha. So aro, being able to have it very clear, and the notion of ha, of the breath, and that we share a breath, we share a consciousness as sentient beings all around the world. And so while I talk from my Indigenous standpoint, it's within that collective consciousness to be able to elevate and to lift the vibration, to return our foodways for us back into the loving hands of communities.
Ngā mihi.
Ngā mihi.
I really appreciate Jessica for sharing her perspectives with us. There's a lot in there to consider, especially for those of us working in the conservation and regenerative agriculture space. You can learn more about Jessica's work at papawhakaritorito.com, as well as her website, jessicahutchings.org. There's links in the show notes, as well as to all of the media that was mentioned in this discussion. You might also be interested in the conversations we had with Aaron Matariki Carr of River and Jan Hania of Biome Trust. As always, you can find all of our episodes at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.